this morning, and you can turn to to Daniel chapter 7. I want to say it's on page 833. Let me pray for us as we get into God's Word together. Father in heaven, it is good to come before you on this morning together as a community, as this congregation of faith, and lift you up as being a holy God, as being a faithful God, as being the same God that we can read about and see over the course of history in the way that you have just surrounded your people with goodness, with mercy, with grace. Lord, I pray that you would rain that grace down on us this morning. Lord, would you make clear what may be unclear? Would you give us, Lord, what we need, and share with us, Lord, your heart. In the name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. A number of months ago, I was having some conversations with people, much like yourself, or maybe even some of you in the room, about where we would be headed as we came into the book of Daniel. So weeks before that series began, the series that we're currently in, some people came up to me and had a rather familiar question. They said, where are we headed next? It's a question that I often get as we close one series and are working our way towards another. I try not to take it terribly personal, that they're asking where we're going to go next, as if it's an itch to get out of where we are now. But they are just wanting to know, what are we going to be studying now? What is going to be the next book of the Bible that we look at, or what series topic are we going to be doing? And I would share with them as we were approaching the book of Daniel that we're going to actually be going into the book of Daniel together. The follow-up question that just about everybody had was, are we going to be doing the whole book? Which is an odd question, because I don't typically just stop somewhere halfway in between a book and say, I think we've had enough of that book and it's time to move on. But as you look at chapter 7 in the book of Daniel, if you've done a little bit of pre-reading and looked ahead, you would say, well, that would be the reason as to why they would ask, are we going to do the whole thing, or are we going to stop at chapter 6 and not make our way through? Chapter 7, they're different waters. Many would say that they're deeper waters. The complexities of chapters 7 through 12 in the book of Daniel, they can be fairly extensive. And so as we look at Daniel chapter 7, and as we go into 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, particularly today is pretty heavy on teaching, I would say. There's a lot to cover. It's a mouthful, no doubt. I shared with you a phrase, a sentence fairly often that I picked up along the way. The phrase is, or the sentence is, the main things are the plain things, and the plain things are the main things. And if there's a great time to put that into action, Daniel chapter 7 would be it, for sure. Chad Van Dixhoorn, in his book, Confessing the Faith, shares something I think that's rather important for us as we begin this section. I'm going to read just a little bit of what he gives at the front of his book. He says, we cannot fail to notice that we all read the Bible at different levels. Some Christians understand the Bible better than other Christians. We are not all teachers and not all seasoned saints. Some are just entering the Bible for the first time, and there are many doors that have yet to be entered, or not yet entered, and many corners they have yet to explore. And maybe you come in this morning feeling like, yeah, that's me right there. There's a lot that I still don't know. In fact, when I pick up the Bible, you may say, it's almost like a foreign language. People that I'm not familiar with, places that I'm not familiar with. He says as he continues, given that certain portions of the Bible are demanding, it is important to be humble as we approach the Bible and listen carefully to those who teach it. We must not reject an interpretation of the Bible simply because it is challenging to understand. On the contrary, we should remember that this is God's revelation of himself, and we should not expect that everything revealed about the triune God will be easy for humans to grasp. I was having a conversation with some of our staff members earlier this week, and the topic of golf got brought up, which is not a far stretch for us. It's a fairly easy topic to talk about. And I was sharing with some of the staff members who haven't played this particular course that there's a course in the area that has a number of blind spots to it, a lot of blind holes. And if you don't have the local knowledge, it'll be very difficult to navigate this course. In fact, as you look to take a shot, maybe a tee shot from one of the holes that you can't necessarily see where the pin or the flag is, you could be going the complete opposite direction from what you're supposed to be going in, and it's going to take you 3 or 4 shots to get back even to the fairway. In so many ways, it's important for us to start off with a firm foundation. Chapter 7 is a chapter that just gives you, it's like drinking from a fire hose in a lot of ways. There's a lot to cover here, and we have to do so with humility. And we have to do so in a way that isn't terribly dogmatic about the things that aren't main and plain. I was told in one of my seminary classes, and I don't remember the class, but I remember the statement because it was just so clear and precise. The statement was, we as Christians, as believers, as followers of Christ, should be quiet where the Bible is quiet and speak loudly where the Bible is loud. We want to make sure that as we go into Daniel chapter 7 and the following chapters, that we make sure that we're doing that. When you turn the page, and maybe you don't need to, but in it, so to speak, turn the page from chapter 6 to chapter 7. You'll notice that there are some distinct differences. You'll notice, number one, that the genre changes. You'll notice that Daniel goes from a narrative form of writing to an apocalyptic form of writing. The literature changes in that. You'll notice that his perspective changes. Chapters 1 through 6, Daniel is speaking in the third person. Starting in chapter 7, verse 2, he switches to the first person. I saw a vision. I woke up. I did these things. The last thing that you'll notice is that the content is a bit different. That he goes from these historical narrative stories about his life, about his friend's life, and their life in Babylon as exiles, to visions and to dreams. And you wonder why the shift? Why such a drastic shift as you go from one half of Daniel to the second half of Daniel? And the fact is that God has given him visions. That God has given him insight, and instead of Daniel just breaking into the story at certain parts throughout the first 6 chapters, he saves it, he waits. And he shares these visions that God gives him over the course of not only the later years of his life, and he holds on to them and he shares them with us, chapters 7 through 12. And as you look at chapter 7, verse 1, you'll notice that there's a timestamp. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. Something that you should be aware of in reading the Bible and in reading a passage like Daniel chapter 7 is that it's not in chronological order as we come into Daniel chapter 7. What you'll notice is that Belshazzar's story is actually in Daniel chapter 5. And we're given just the last 24 hours of Belshazzar's reign in Daniel chapter 5. And so as we take Daniel chapter 7 and we look at it as a body of believers, we have to take Daniel chapter 7 and actually kind of insert it in time in between chapters 4 and 5. That's when Belshazzar was reigning. And so in the first year of Belshazzar, we know that this took place. The same thing happens in chapter 8 and in chapter 9 and in chapter 10, where there's a time stamp that's been given. The language that Daniel speaks in, this apocalyptic literature language that he uses, he does so, and God gives him these visions in this way because he's trying to describe the indescribable. I don't know if you've ever had those moments in your life when something was so glorious or terrifying that you just couldn't put it into words. I just can't put that sunset. It was so beautiful. The color schemes, like you just had to have been there. Or that creature in a movie that you've never seen before. It was a terrifying creature. It didn't look like any other kind of an animal that you've ever seen before. And you're just trying to describe it, and words aren't enough. You need more descriptive angles for it, but you can't get it. This is kind of the way that Daniel is speaking within these visions that he's trying to share with us, the church. And as he shares these things, he's conveying a message in such a way. It's brilliant, this apocalyptic literature. Because if he were to only share it in a way that the people of Babylon or the Hebrew people of Jerusalem, they might get it and understand it because of their time and culture and the way in which life was happening at that time. If they got it, we might not. We wouldn't have a clue. And the same thing would be true for them. That if Daniel were just writing to us in 2024, in our culture and in the things that we're dealing with, they wouldn't have a clue as to what he was talking about to us. And so this brings it all together. The way that he writes does so in such a beautiful fashion, but man, it's complicated. Unfortunately, when people tend to look at Daniel chapter 7 through 12, the book of Revelation, what often happens is that people will try to, in a sense, chart a map or a calendar and think to themselves, okay, so I'm going to bring these pieces in, and this is what this means, and it's going to fit this calendar in this way, and it's all going to take place. And that is actually not why those books are written in the way that they are. The fact is that the very reason why we have Daniel 7 through 12, the very reason why we have the book of Revelation, is to share with us that God is still on the throne, that God has this all under control, that kingdoms rise and that kingdoms fall, and he's over it all. And you might say to yourself, that sounds a whole lot like we just went through in chapters 1 through 6. And you would be right. The theme continues. The theme doesn't change. Even though the style changes and the content changes to some degree, it is still the same message. And as we step back from the picture a bit, and not get too close to the story, but step back and we say, okay, I can see it. And you say, Ryan, you're stalling at this point, but I'm gonna get there. I promise you this. As we get into Daniel chapter 7, I learned some things about the International Space Station that I found helpful, at least to me, within my study of Daniel 7. The International Space Station is something that I don't think about very often, if ever. But what I do now know is that it actually is up 250 miles off the face of the earth, which doesn't sound like a lot until you put it into feet. It's actually 1.3 million feet above the earth. It travels at a rate of 17,500 miles per hour. It circles the planet every 90 minutes. Which means that it goes around the earth 16 times a day. It takes a picture at various points, maybe all throughout, but if you were to take a picture from the International Space Station at San Francisco, the city of San Francisco, just give it 10 minutes and it'll be right on top of New York City. This thing is moving. Daniel chapter 7 is structured in a way that we actually have, much like the speed that the International Space Station is traveling, that it's going to speak of the things of Daniel's day all the way up through the return of Christ, and ultimately the end of the kingdom of darkness. There's a lot to cover here in Daniel chapter 7. We're not going to get to all of it. We're going to save the middle section there, oddly enough, for another Sunday. But I'll give you the reason why. But let's take a look at Daniel 7, verse 1, and we'll actually break it up into half here, 1 through 14. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying in bed. He wrote down the substance of his dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion. It had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a human being, and the mind of a human was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that, I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard, and on its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and was given the authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little horn, which came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a human being, and a mouth that spoke boastfully. And as I looked, we're going to take a look at verses 9 through 14 here, even though we're not going to get into it much today. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow. The hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch. Because of the boastful words the horn was speaking, I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, power, and glory and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshiped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And that is why people stop at chapter 6 and decide, that'll be enough for us. What in the world is happening here? What is taking place with these beasts? What does it all mean? What does it mean for us? What did it mean for them? Verses 2 and 3 are actually a very good place for us to start. And in verses 2 and 3, it says, "And there before me," Daniel speaking, "were the 4 winds of heaven, churning up the great sea." Well, why is that significant? It's significant because the winds of heaven are coming out of where? They're out of heaven. These 4 winds are converging, speaking to the fact that God is not surprised by these beasts. God is not taken off guard by these beasts suddenly coming out of the sea. What am I going to do with these beasts now that they're here? No, in fact, it was the winds of heaven that brought these beasts forth out of the sea. God is in control of all of these things. It's how the book of Daniel begins. The book of Daniel begins this way. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. From the very beginning, we see in the book of Daniel that God is directing. Even a foreign pagan God or a pagan king to come and overtake and then take the exiles back with them, and the articles from the temple. It's all God initiating all of these things in the course of history. And if God was doing that then for them, is he not doing that now for us? Is he still not in control in the midst of an election year? In the midst of all the things that are taking place within a nation? I wonder if you believe that. If I'm honest, if I'm being completely transparent with you, I do believe that. And I still struggle at times. Kind of like that father. Mark chapter 9. His father brings his son to Jesus. The son's demon-possessed. This demon continues to throw his son down, goes into convulsions and seizures. At times, he throws his son into the fire. At times, he throws him into the water. And in desperation, the man goes to Jesus and says, "If you can do anything, will you help me? Because I don't know what else to do." And Jesus looks at him and says, "If I can, don't you know that everything is possible for the one who believes?" And the man looks back at Jesus and he says to him this, "Lord, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. Help me overcome it." I think the truth is that as we look at these things that are happening within our own world and with our own lives, it might be easier for us to look back in history and say, why didn't they just put their trust in God? And the fact is that we struggle sometimes. But we do believe. God is sovereign over all these things. Though the earth may pass away and the mountains fall into the sea, do not fear. Psalm 46. Why? Because God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. We get to these beasts of Daniel chapter 7. And the million-dollar question is, how do we interpret these? And the three schools of thought are this. And I'll leave you with these three schools of thought, and then I'll share with you where I'm coming from. One school of thought is that it's actually these beasts are referring to what took place in Daniel chapter 2. And this dream of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2. One of the schools of thought is that these are referring to, it's more figurative, and it's figurative all the way. It's actually referring to time periods, and these time periods aren't necessarily identifiable, but they're figurative language. The third school of thought is that it's all future-based. None of these things have happened, or they're just in the midst of happening even as we live and breathe. But they're really all in a future context. I'm going to share my viewpoint with you. And I am fully aware that there may be some people that disagree, and that's okay. Brothers and sisters, I don't see an issue with that. We can have a debate over it, absolutely. I don't think it's an issue to die for or divide for. But it is definitely an issue to talk about, and I'd love to have that conversation with you. But let me just share with you what I see taking place here, and I think that verse 17 is helpful. We haven't read verse 17 yet, but we should. It says, "The four great beasts are four kings that will rise from the earth." So if we're looking for what's main and plain, it seems to be main and plain to me. James Montgomery Boyce, in his commentary, writes this. He says, "The most obvious thing to be said about this vision in Daniel chapter 7 is that it is parallel to Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great statue made up of various kinds of metals, although this vision adds significant new details." I would probably state that in a more diplomatic way, but I do fall into that same camp. And the reason why I believe that is for this reason. For a variety of reasons, but one of the main reasons is something that I shared back in Daniel chapter 2. In Daniel chapter 2, the original language that the book of Daniel was written in, changes. Daniel chapter 1, from the very beginning of Daniel chapter 2, is written in the Hebrew language originally. Daniel then changes to the Aramaic language, from Daniel chapter 2, verse 4 to the end of chapter 7. At the beginning of chapter 8, he moves back to the Hebrew language. As I look at that piece of information, that I think is an important piece of information, it links chapter 2 and chapter 7 for me in such a way that makes sense. That Daniel is writing, wanting the Babylonian people, which Aramaic was the Babylonian language that they spoke, to know and to understand even further, to a further degree, what chapter 2 states. In chapter 2, what we found back then is that this symbol, this statue that Nebuchadnezzar sees, that Daniel interprets for him, it's this massive statue, if you remember, if you've read Daniel chapter 2. It's this statue that has a gold head, a silver chest, bronze midsection, and it has iron legs with kind of a clay and iron mix within its feet. And we identified those as kingdoms. Kingdoms that clearly it speaks of the head being Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. Then we move in the course of history to the Medo-Persian Empire. Then it goes to the Grecian Empire. And then it goes to the Roman Empire. So as we look at these beasts, we look at beast number 1. And it says, like a lion. This beast number 1 was like a lion with the wings of an eagle. Interesting that in Babylon, the walls and the gates often had pictures of lions on them. Nebuchadnezzar is referred to in the book of Jeremiah as both a lion and an eagle at certain times within the book of Jeremiah. If we go back to Daniel chapter 4, we see Nebuchadnezzar get his wings cut off, so to speak, or torn off. He spends 7 years living in the fields, humbled. He comes back. God restores him with the mind of a human again. Beast number 1. Beast number 2. Daniel says it was like a bear, raised up on one side with 3 ribs in his mouth. The Medo-Persian Empire would be the next empire. What we know to be true about the Medo-Persian Empire is that the Persian side was always the stronger side. It was almost, in a sense, raised up with the Medes below it. The 3 ribs. Cyrus was the king of the Persian Empire. His son would follow in his footsteps and succeed him. They would conquer 3 kingdoms: the Lydian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, and the Egyptian Empire. I wonder if those are the 3 ribs being devoured within the bear's teeth. Beast number 3. Daniel describes it like a leopard with 4 wings and with 4 heads. Interesting picture. What we know to be true about leopards is that they're very, very fast, swift as all get out. You add wings to this beast, and this leopard becomes even faster and more swift. If we're going down the empires, what we find is Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, then Greece. Who was in charge of Greece at this time? Alexander the Great. It was said of Alexander the Great that he conquered more land in a faster way than anybody before him. By the age of 32, he, in 10 years, had done such a destructive work to gain land and territory for Greece than anyone before. He would take armies of 30,000 and go up against armies of 150,000 on one occasion, 400,000 on the next occasion, 800,000 on the next occasion, and he would just clobber them. Where do the 4 heads come in? At the age of 32, Alexander the Great died. His son did not succeed him. There was no son to succeed him, and so his kingdom was given to 4 generals. Beast number 3. Daniel would have been privy to the rise and the fall of the Babylonian Empire. He lived it. He would have seen Cyrus and the Persians and the Medes coming in and really kind of gaining territory and gaining strength. He would have never seen Greece for sure. But as we take a step back, we begin to see Daniel through the lens of world history and think to ourselves, God is sovereign over it all. Psalm 2. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth rise up and the rulers band together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their chains and throw off their shackles. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath, saying, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. And that's exactly where Daniel chapter 7, verses 9 through 14 take us. I felt like verses 9 through 14 needed more than just a few minutes. And so we're going to come back to that. We're going to come back and take a look specifically at verses 9 through 14 together at a different time. But in the meantime, there's a fourth kingdom. And this fourth kingdom, Daniel sees it, and he can't describe it with similar verbiage. It's terrifying. I can't put an animal to it. It's a beast that I'm unfamiliar with. And he says about this beast that it was different from all the former beasts and that it had 10 horns. And Daniel wanted to know. Verse 15. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The 4 great beasts are 4 kings that will rise from the earth. But the holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and its bronze claws. The beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell. The horn that looked more imposing than the others and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people and defeating them until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High. And the time came when they possessed the kingdom. And then he gave me this explanation. The 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones, and he will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. The holy people will be delivered into his hands for a time, times, and a half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale. But I kept the matter to myself. If we go back to the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel chapter 2, this large, dazzling, enormous in appearance statue starts with the head of gold, moves its way down, and what we find, interesting enough, is that as it works its way down, the metals lose. They decrease in cost. But as you go down, they increase in strength. And we get down to the legs of iron. And we've stated that clearly out of history was the Roman Empire. It was the one that followed the Grecian Empire. But then we say here, with these 10 horns and these 10 kings, and we go, the Roman Empire's gone. It's been gone for quite some time. It was a long kingdom, longer than the rest, lasting almost 1,000 years in length. But what do we do now? Because the 10 kings, you can't literally put that together through history to say, yeah, this is king number 1, king number 2, and so on. It doesn't work literally translated in the course of history. So we have to take that as potentially saying, could the Roman Empire be reinstated at some point in time? Could it be that the effects of the Roman Empire are long withstanding and have great influence into where things are going within the world in which we live? And out of this empire will come 10 kings, confederation of sorts. I think that Revelation chapter 17 will do us some good. It says this: the 10 horns you saw, this speaking now to the Apostle John. John seeing this vision. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour, in other words, a short time, will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them, because he's the Lord of lords and the King of kings. And with him will be called, chosen, and faithful followers. Sounds a lot like Daniel 7, doesn't it? Who is this beast that John refers to here? Who is this little horn that Daniel talks about in Daniel chapter 7? Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 will call him the man of lawlessness. John will refer to him as the beast coming out of the sea in Revelation chapter 13. Verse 20 of Daniel 7 states him this way: the horn that looked more imposing than the others and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. Verse 25, he will speak against the Most High and oppress his holy people and try to change the set times and the laws. Essentially, this man is the Antichrist. He is the one who will come up against all that is good, all that is God. He is the personification of evil. If you were to put eyes and a mouth and arms and legs on a picture of evil, though he would not look as disturbing as we would like him to look, he would be the Antichrist. He would be the one that is against it all. And it develops in such a way that Daniel ends in verse 28 by saying, I was deeply troubled by my thoughts. I was more than intrigued. I was troubled. My face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. As I began to think about his response in all this, and I'll close with this, I began to think about Mary. I began to think about the angel that came to Mary and shared with her the news that the angel did. And it says about Mary in Luke chapter 1, Mary was greatly troubled at his words and wondered what kind of greeting this might be. And the angel says to Mary, Mary, don't be afraid. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and you will have a son. And you are to call him Jesus. And this son of yours, he will reign. He will be great. He will be called the Son of the Most High. And his kingdom will last forever. Then you go to chapter 2 of Luke. Jesus comes. And what's her response? But Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. I think that's the invitation for us today. I think it's the invitation for us this morning. That as we come into Daniel chapter 7, that we treasure these things up, that we ponder them, that we take what's main and plain, that we consider the fact that God is over it all. He's sovereign over his creation. He rises up leaders. He brings others down. It's all his doing. He's over it all. And we do it in light of verses 26 and 27. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. And then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of all the kingdoms under heaven will be handed over to the holy people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. And we ponder that. Father in heaven, Lord, I just want to consider and thank you with a grateful heart for the way that your word establishes such a firm and assurance within my own heart about things that have taken place already and things that are yet to develop. As I think about it all, as I think about us as a congregation, as I think about us as a church here in Oakdale, California, Lord, would you move? Would you move in us? Would the message that there is a sovereign, holy, all-powerful God who is over and reigns over things like upcoming elections, things like economies that are a mess, things that, like the people in our life, the questions that they're asking. May it be our answer. And Lord, would you give us courage and strength to step in and speak truth in these matters? To say there's a God who's over it all. There's a God who reigns and he sits on the throne. And I don't need to worry about tomorrow. God's got it figured out. In the name of Jesus Christ, I pray. Amen.